as I was saying in the other room, every 2 years or so, I like to do a class on church history or history of God's people. And going back over what we've done over the years, we've covered a lot of ground. I think the first one that I did was on early church history, say 2nd and 3rd century A.D. We've done a class on the Reformation, the Restoration. We've done some Jewish history classes, history of the Jewish nation, and we talked about the history of the intertestamental period, the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's about 400 years in there between the two covenants. And there's not a whole lot left outside of biblical history, which we cover all the time, except for the Dark Ages. And that is a much neglected period of history. And yet there's a lot going on in that time. And the name itself will tell you why it is neglected. Let me talk a little bit about what we mean by the Dark Ages, also known as the Middle Ages or the medieval time. This is a time period, roughly speaking, between the fall of Rome in the 5th century A.D. and the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century A.D. So roughly that time period. We're going to start a little earlier than that because the events that are important for us to remember regarding the church are a little different than the movements that occurred in politics and governments and society and art and so on. So you adjust the time frame just a little bit depending on what field you're discussing. Of course, we're concerned about the church. Why is it called the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages? Because the people of the Renaissance are the ones who named this time period. Here's the way they looked at it. They see it as the early classical period or the classical time of antiquity, and then the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance, or the rebirth. And in their mind, what was reborn was classical antiquity. Those Greek and Roman artists and scholars, architects, statesmen, and thinkers and philosophers that they believed were very important. So those died out around 4th century, and then it wasn't until the 1500s and so on that that interest in those kinds of ways of thinking reemerged. So to the people who named this time period, the time that we're talking about was a time with no architectural development, no art development, no cultural development, no philosophical development, no religious or theological development. And so that was a dark time, anti-intellectual time. No advancements, no developments. But as you will see this quarter, that is not the case. This is a time where many things happen. There were many developments that explain why life is the way that it is today. You're gonna hear a lot of things that just make the light bulb go off. One such moment for me was I was reading along and I read about the time when the Roman government made Christianity a legal religion. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that this morning. And one of the things involved in that was giving the Christian preachers and ministers some benefits that belonged to pagan priests. And that one little change is why I have a housing allowance today from the United States government. Never understood why preachers had something like that. But that kind of idea that ministers should have certain kind of benefits other people don't have from government regarding taxation started during this time period of the Dark Ages. And we do a lot of things today that we don't understand has carried over from this time frame. And so this is what we're going to talk about. Here's a timeline I should have put up a long time ago. And I was picturing this in a smaller classroom, so I realize you can't see this very well. The yellow lines there indicate events that occurred during the Dark Ages. And you can see it had a slow start over here in the 4th century. You have a few events such as the move of the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, the coronation of Constantine as emperor, the Council of Nicaea, things like that. But then it really picks up, and you can see all the way up till about 1500, you have a number of events that were very important to the Middle Ages. Some of the things up on this chart are the rule of Justinian, excommunication of Henry IV. You have the bubonic plague. Everybody knows about Black Death. That's one thing that people could pick up. Maybe the Magna Carta, Charlemagne, Byzantine Empire, the fall of Rome. So these are events that you know maybe a little about, maybe a lot, but these make up the Middle Ages, about 1,000-year time period. There has to have been something important going on during that time. We're going to start talking about it with the reign of Constantine, or a little before that. I think with regard to church history, Constantine is really where you need to start the Middle Ages. He was a very important Roman emperor. I'll get to him in just a moment, but you can't talk about Constantine without talking about Diocletian, his predecessor. Diocletian was the fiercest persecutor of Christians who ever lived in terms of Roman persecutors. Okay, maybe there were some Jewish persecutors that could compete with him very well, but he had a lot of power being a Roman emperor, and nobody knows exactly why, but he instigated a fierce persecution of the church. You might think, well, what about Nero? Nero lived during Peter and Paul's time in the early 60s AD, and he persecuted the church to a degree, but only in the city of Rome. Diocletian did an empire-wide persecution. Now, some things were going on before Diocletian's time that may explain some of this. During the 3rd century, 30 people vied for the position of emperor in Rome. Rome was in a lot of trouble, and it was not looking good for the Roman Empire. People were starting to see it crack, and a lot of historians say that if it weren't for Diocletian, the Roman Empire would have fallen long before it actually did. But he came in at about 284 AD, and he served until 305. He did not serve until his death, because one of the things that he did when he came in is he said, emperors should not serve a lifetime. One of the biggest problems we have is we're constantly at war as people are fighting to become emperor. So he set up term limits, and he also divided the power of the empire into 4 positions. 2 of them were called Augusti, and 2 of them were called Caesars. The 2 Augusti, each known as Augustus, they would serve in 2 different parts of the empire in the highest positions, and the Caesars were slightly subordinate to them. If you've never heard this before, it's because Diocletian set it up. He effectively set it up, but after his death, it all fell apart. So it never was a long-term political solution for Rome. But Diocletian, you could see, had a lot of political savvy. He wasn't just a fierce warrior, but he also knew a few things about politics. But he was bloodthirsty. I mean, the way that he became emperor was by, I think, lancing his rival through with a spear in front of the Roman Senate. I mean, just how would you like for that to happen at Congress one day? But during a meeting of the Roman Senate, his rival was there, and he just murdered him in front of everybody and said, "I'm emperor." And so that's how he came to the throne. So it was a combination of ruthlessness and wits, which is a very dangerous combination if you're on the wrong side of that. And the Christians, for some reason, were on the wrong side of that with Diocletian. Maybe because they did not regard the Roman emperors as the rest of the world did, as being divine or being the sons of God. They did not revere them. They did not worship them, because Christians then as now only recognized one God. That may be it. We just don't know exactly why. But he started killing Christians, imprisoning Christians, and he did something that no persecutor before Christians did, which shows again his knowledge and wisdom about things, is he started rounding up copies of Scripture and burning them. Because he knew that these were people of the book. And in order to squelch Christianity, you had to get rid of the Word of God. So he did that, but thankfully, as he promised in 305, he stepped down from the throne. And as planned, others took the positions of the Augusti, of the Caesars, and he went into retirement. Well, when that happened, public opinion was swaying towards the Christians. Because during this time period, this would be late 3rd century, the Christians were dying in droves, but they were showing that they were willing to die for what they believed. They were given opportunities, for example, to renounce their faith, and they wouldn't do it. The public would see them standing before a Roman soldier, renounce your God or die. And they would say, you'll have to kill me, I'm not going to renounce my God. And the public was seeing this happen over and over and over again. Christians being imprisoned, tortured, maimed, killed. And they were starting to get tired of the bloodshed because the martyrs were winning over the public. And this was bad for Rome. There was a successor to Diocletian named Galerius. Galerius did not like the Christians, but due to overwhelming public pressure, while he was dying on his deathbed, he stopped the persecution. He ordered the end of the persecution of Christians. It didn't necessarily make Christianity a legal religion just yet. It was still regarded as illegal, but it was on its way to becoming legal, and the persecution was ending. So that was a big moment. Now this brings us to Constantine. After these men, Diocletian, Galerius, were moved out of the way, unfortunately the empire started becoming more centralized again as people were vying for the #1 seat. And Constantine, whose father was one of the Augusti in Great Britain, Constantine was way out there in the west, but he wanted to be emperor. And he was a great military commander, yet the odds were stacked against him. His rival was Maxentius, and Maxentius had a larger army, and he was in Rome. But there's a story that says that as Constantine came to this bridge, the Milvian Bridge, just outside of Rome, he camped and he had a dream. And he dreamed that he saw the sign of a cross and heard a voice saying, "In this sign, conquer." And the next morning in 312 AD, Constantine and his smaller army attacked Maxentius, conquered him, won the battle, and became emperor at that point. Now, did that really happen? Who knows? This could have been a story that Constantine told to win Christians over. Maybe he had a dream. I have serious doubts about whether that was really divine intervention, because I don't think God was really concerned about whether or not Constantine became emperor. Maybe he was. Who knows? It's all a matter of public opinion, all a matter of opinion. But he did win the battle, and it changed history. And in some ways, it favored Christians. In some ways, it created some problems. 313, Constantine legalized Christianity. He wasn't baptized, however, until 337. And you might think, well, if he was such a big fan of Christianity, why did he wait until his deathbed in 337 to be baptized? And that's a good question. One answer to that is maybe he wasn't really a Christian. Maybe he was just trying to do whatever brought the empire together. Maybe he was trying to win the favor of Christians by saying all of these Christian things. But another theory that I find quite interesting is there was this feeling back in his day in the church, it was very common, that after you were baptized you couldn't sin, because if you sinned after your baptism there was no second law of pardon, no hope for redemption after that. There were a lot of people who were trying to time their baptism out to the very end so that they could be baptized right before their death and then die without any sins in their name. And this is probably what Constantine was doing. Of course, if you're a military commander, you've got to rely on a lot of luck for that plan to work out. But it worked out for him, and he was baptized on his deathbed in 337. And in 380, his successor, Theodosius, made Christianity the official state religion. So it was simply legal during Constantine's time, and then his successor made it the official state religion. Now, this is why these guys are so important to the beginning of this time period. What do you think happens when the church moves from being a persecuted church to the official state religion? Just think about it. You can probably come up with some things that actually did happen. What do you think happens? I want to know your thoughts on this. That's a major shift, right?
Some people making power grabs.
Okay, some people in the church, right? And that's exactly what happens. The church becomes allied to the state, and eventually it comes to the point where the church is more powerful than the state. And so power corrupts, and it did have a corrupting influence on the church.
There were increased people becoming Christians, moving into the church.
Many, many more people. But when it's safe, that is one of the consequences. More people move in. But another consequence is when it's safe to do it, there's a lot of nominal Christians in name only. They're not true blue Christians. They're not willing to die. Remember, right before this time period, Christians were dying for their faith. And you see a lot less martyrdom, which means a lot less people having to make sacrifices for their faith. You see that too.
Those two are going to go together. You want to get people that don't really care about Christianity so much, but they care about the power, so they're doing one to get the other when that starts.
Yeah, they become Christians to get the power. Yeah, that's exactly right. So the church was much purer prior to this. When this happened, yes, it's nice that people aren't having to die for their faith. Yes, it's nice that somebody as powerful as Constantine and the emperors after him are promoting the Christian faith. And we often pray for that today. Let our leaders be Christians. Let's have a Christian influence in our leadership. But if you start thinking about it, there are some undesirable consequences that come from that as well. And they did. Major shifts. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church became the most powerful institution on earth. There's one example where the citizens of a Greek city murdered their governor. I think this was in Thessalonica, because he had put to death a very popular charioteer who had been charged with practicing homosexuality. So the citizens of this city, Thessalonica, they murdered the governor of their city. That's a bad thing, right? Well, Theodosius, the man who made Christianity the official state religion, the emperor, he came in and he slaughtered 7,000 Thessalonians. So they overreacted. He really overreacted. Now, I'm telling this to illustrate the power that was growing in the church, because here's what happened. I get my places mixed up here, but in Milan, there was a bishop named Ambrose. You probably heard his name at least, Ambrose. And Ambrose was incensed over what the emperor had done in slaughtering 7,000 Thessalonians. And so this is the first time this kind of thing ever happened. He excommunicated Theodosius, the Roman emperor. Just a local bishop in Milan excommunicated the emperor. Very brave thing to do. This guy had just killed 7,000 people. But to show you how powerful the church had become, Theodosius finally bowed to that, took off his imperial robes in a public assembly, and made a confession and repented. And after some time, Ambrose said it was okay to start giving him communion again. Now, this kind of thing would not have happened 100 years prior to this. This happened in 390 A.D. How quickly things change. Because in 311, Christianity was illegal. So within a century, things had gone all the way to the other extreme. Another example to show you how powerful the church was, it was in 800 that Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor. So you have popes crowning emperors, whereas that kind of thing would have never happened just a few years before. Also, church leadership became hierarchical. This is another big shift in Christianity. So what I mean by that is, in the New Testament, you see elders, a group of elders, overseeing individual congregations. Acts 14, verse 23 is one place where you see that. Titus chapter 1, verse 5 is another place where you see that. That's how we're organized here at Ashville Road. But now you start to see a hierarchy develop, where you'll have one bishop over congregations, and then you'll have a bishop over a set of churches, and then eventually bishops came to rule provinces. And the bishops over the provinces were called archbishops, and then eventually the hierarchy grew to the point where the most important cities were given patriarchs. And those cities were, if I can remember them, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria in Egypt, and then later on Jerusalem because of its spiritual significance. So you had 5 patriarchs, and they were ranked in order, sometimes Rome being the most important, Constantinople, when it was developed, the second important, and sometimes those would shift around. Eventually, the highest patriarch was known as what? The Pope, right? So a papacy developed, where you had one leader over the whole church. That, of course, is a major shift that had a lot of effects as well. Also, the church became militarized during this time period. They actually started going to war. During the Middle Ages, you have the Crusades, you have the rise of Islam. At one point during the Dark Ages, Muslims had 3 times the territory of the Roman Empire. So they had more territory than Rome, and this started scaring the church authorities, and they started militarizing and going to war in an unsuccessful attempt known as the Crusades. And we're going to learn all about that in this class as well, and what that was all about. So a lot of other examples could be given, but this shows what I'm trying to show is the major shifts that occurred in Christianity that characterized this time period, this 1,000-year time period. And you can see how it's so different from the New Testament. So this leads to an important question, and the question is this: what happened to the Lord's church during the Middle Ages? Was it completely lost? You know, when we say the Dark Ages, some people get the idea that means it was dark, there was no light, there was no gospel, there was no truth, no Christian people, just this state, militarized, corrupt church. Is that what happened? And if it is, what does that mean about all the people who were lost during that time frame? It's really awful to think about that kind of thing. So we're going to look at a few scriptures as we have time and talk about that question for just a moment. I want to go to this one first. Let's go to Acts chapter 20, verse 28. Now this shows that Paul knew these shifts were coming. He knew that they were coming soon after his departure. And he warned the elders of the church at Ephesus that they would come from church leaders, not from the outside. These problems would come from within the church, not from outside the church. Listen to what he says here in addressing the Ephesian elders from Miletus in Acts 20, verse 28. Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God which he obtained with his own blood. Verse 29. I know that after my departure, he's talking about his death, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them. And notice he says, this threat is going to come from among your own selves. What did we just talk about? The church in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, even 4th centuries was fairly pure, fairly close to what we read in the New Testament. You see a lot of faithfulness. You see very little corruption. Nobody's power hungry. People are willing to die for their faith. It's all about Christ. He's the most important thing. Then the power comes in, and the church becomes corrupt. Was it the outside threat or the inside threat that damaged the church the most? The outside threat seemed only to purify the church. Persecution seemed to be the fire that refined the church and made it better. It was the power that corrupted the church from within. Just as Paul's saying, from among your own selves, fierce wolves will come in, and men will speak twisted things and draw away the disciples after them. So he was right on target about what would happen. He says these things again in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Let's turn over there and read those two verses. Okay, now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared. Then he gives a couple of examples. Who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. So again, he says, this is not within my lifetime, but in later times. He doesn't specify exactly when those times are, but in the times after this, some will depart from the faith. And how will they do that? By devoting themselves to wrong teaching. He says, deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, or doctrines of devils, King James. And these are liars who have no conscience. Their consciences are seared. And what examples does he give of the kind of teachings they're going to bring? Forbidding marriage. Does that sound familiar? Did that happen? For sure. In the state church. Priests still today not allowed to marry. And also abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving. So abstinence, asceticism, harm to the body in the name of God, these kinds of things will go to the extreme degree during the Middle Ages. And Paul is seeing these things by inspiration much earlier. Another very interesting passage is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Let's turn over there. Now, the two letters to the Thessalonians address a lot of misconceptions about the end of time and the second coming of Christ. It's only natural for the Christians when they first hear that Jesus is coming back to think that he's coming back very soon, that his coming is imminent, that, it's not within millennia or centuries, but within years, months, maybe even weeks, maybe even days. And the Christians at Thessalonica were under that idea, and so Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians to correct a misunderstanding regarding the second coming of Christ. And so that's how the second chapter of 2nd Thessalonians begins, where he says, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus and our being gathered together to him, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. So some were saying, you missed it. It's already come. Jesus came back, got who he wanted. He's gone. You missed out. He's saying that has not happened. And to reassure them, he gives them a couple of indications that they should watch for before he would come back. Two in particular. So this is verse 3. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless, number 1, the rebellion comes first, and number 2, the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. Now this is an exceedingly difficult passage to understand. Okay? But it's very clear that he does say two things are going to happen before Jesus comes back. And the first is, my translation says rebellion, some say falling away. The Greek word is apostasia, which is like our word apostasy. So there's going to be a great falling away from the faith. Do you remember that's the exact language that Paul uses in 1 Timothy 4 and in Acts chapter 20. Some will draw away disciples, fall away from the faith, a falling away. Okay? And the second is the revelation of the man of lawlessness or the man of sin, a son of perdition. And I have some ideas of what that could be, but I really can't tell you with any certainty what that is, whether it's a personification of great evil or a particular person in history. The reformers like to say it was the Pope. Others like to say it's Satan himself. There are problems with all the ideas that it is. But those are two things that had not happened in the days of the Thessalonians. The one that interests me is the first one. Paul predicted again here that there was going to be a great falling away from the faith on the part of a large share of Christianity. There was going to be major shifts in the church. What he was doing was he was looking forward and he was seeing the Middle Ages, because that's what happened in the Middle Ages. And so we have this question before us: what happened to the church in the Middle Ages? Was all lost? Did Christianity disappear? Are we here today only because the gospel as a seed is indestructible, or is the church itself indestructible? Did it exist in pockets here and there? Can we say that it was destroyed, or can we believe that it continued on? Well, I believe that the Bible teaches that the church has never been destroyed, that it continued throughout the Middle Ages, that there were Christians worshiping according to the simple New Testament gospel, and that the Dark Ages is no exception to the rule. And there are a couple of passages to look at along that line. The first is Daniel chapter 2. Let's go over to Daniel 2. Daniel is interpreting this dream of Nebuchadnezzar about this great image that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of. And the image represented 4 great empires. The head of gold on the image represented the Persian Empire. The Babylonian Empire. The chest of silver represented the Persian Empire. The belly and thighs of bronze represented the Greek Empire. And the legs of iron mixed with clay represented the Roman Empire. And Daniel said that in the days of the Roman Empire, there would come another kingdom. This is verse 44 of Daniel 2. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. So a permanent kingdom would come in and destroy all these other kingdoms. And he's talking here about Jesus' kingdom. The kingdom Jesus talked to Pontius Pilate about. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. That kingdom. And there's no sign here that that kingdom would fade out, disappear for 1,000 years, come back into being. He said it'll stand forever without disruption. Now, you either believe that or you don't believe that. Here's Jesus in Matthew 16:18, a much simpler passage. Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Gates of hell is literally the gates of Hades, the realm of the dead. In other words, the church will not die. He doesn't say, well, it'll die and it'll be resurrected. He says it will not die. And so we have to understand this. We have to have faith in the gospel. Anywhere the gospel can be taught, preached, listened to, obeyed, Christianity can exist. And we have to believe that it was continuing to be taught and obeyed and listened to, and that the church did exist during that time. You know, people fret over this question because they can't find a whole lot of evidence of New Testament churches during this time period. Just this great empire church, this great state church. But you have to look at the way history is written, right? Who writes the history? The people who win, right? And the state church won over all other forms of Christianity, even pure Christianity. That doesn't mean pure Christianity disappeared. It just means the historical sources that we refer back to were written by the people who won. There are some that have done a lot of work digging up examples of New Testament churches that existed in places here and there during that time period. And if we have time, we might look at a few of those. But we can take heart. If the Bible is true, the church did not disappear. It existed during that time. Either the church existed during the Middle Ages or God's Word is not true. That's what it comes down to. So as we look at these things, we'll be disheartened by many of the developments we'll see. We'll be inspired by certain examples, but we need to take heart that God providentially has cared for His church and His people throughout all this time. And I hope that we'll be able to see that. Got a few seconds left. If anybody wants to make a comment or ask a question, now's the time to do it. Anything? It looks like we'll be meeting in here, so we'll just come straight in here next time, and we won't have the transportation issues that we had at the beginning of class this morning. Thanks everybody for being here this morning.